Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome back. This is our 14th conversation brought to you by the Sustainability Laboratory. We are engaging in conversations with some of the leading thinkers and doers across the world who are deeply engaged in the greatest challenge of our time, the challenge of sustainability. And we're delighted that you're here. We're so glad and grateful to those of you who return month after month. It's my great privilege to introduce to you tonight's guest, Karma Tshiteem, who is joining us from Bhutan, where it is 5 o'clock in the morning. We're delighted to have you here and very much looking forward to this conversation. With that, I will hand things over to Dr. Michael Ben-Eli, the founding director of the Sustainability Laboratory.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Welcome, Karma, and thank you very much for joining us tonight. It's really a pleasure to see you. We met some years ago, and it's great to be in touch again. You're joining us, as Elizabeth said, from Bhutan, where it's 5 o'clock in the morning. So thank you, too, for this very unusual hour. We appreciate the effort. What we'd like to do today is to explore with you the concept of gross national happiness, its meaning, history, how it's been implemented in Bhutan, and how it is influencing the world as it has in the last few years. So let's start by first kind of having you introduce yourself to our audience, highlighting your professional profile first. Please.
Good evening, everybody. And thank you for having me on. Well, in terms of my introduction, I think all that's that I would like to share is that I worked, I'm a lifelong public servant. That's what I would describe myself as. And I started my career in the Ministry of Finance in '89. And I've worked in all the various departments of the Ministry of Finance, dealing with development partners, because we are still a developing country. We depend a lot on donors and development assistance, so as to work with development partners. I worked in the budget department. I was involved in formulating the medium-term fiscal frameworks and basically all dealing with matters related to the finances of the country. And I did that from 1989 till about 2006. In between, I also spent a year working at the World Bank in Washington. And in 2006, I got an opportunity to serve under His Majesty the King when he was a crown prince. And I worked there until 2008, when I was appointed as the Secretary of the Gross National Happiness Commission. And as the secretary of this body, which oversees and coordinates the development in the country, and we do that on a 5-year cycle. So I had the opportunity to formulate and implement the 10th 5-year plan. The emphasis that time was on poverty reduction, and we were able to make very good progress. But in addition to that, did many things. And one of the positive aspects of that work was a program we came up with called Targeted Poverty Reduction Interventions, where we identified poverty down to household levels around the country. And I visited most of them, and many of them on foot, because poverty in Bhutan correlates with remoteness, and they were not connected by road, one of the reasons why they were poor. But it was very fulfilling. And after that, I worked as the Secretary of the Gross National Happiness until 2013. And in 2013, I was appointed as the chairperson of the Royal Civil Service Commission, which is the body, a constitutional body that looks after all the civil servants in Bhutan. And during my 5 years, it's a constitutional position with a 5-year tenure. I was involved in spearheading 5 reforms around the civil service to simply enhance public service delivery, and focused a lot on performance management, leadership, and trying to bring a mindset change in the way people serve the public, etc. And I did that right until I finished my tenure in 2019, whereupon I was appointed as the chairman of the National Service Core Working Group. And this is what I'm doing currently. And the responsibility is to work on the National Service Program, a program that all youth of Bhutan will undergo when they finish high school. And we are working to launch this next year. And thank you once again for having me here.
Great. But let's get a little bit more personal. The making of Karma Tshiteem. You know, a few people in our audience will be familiar with Bhutan and its culture. Why don't you tell us something about the country itself, but also about the way you grew up, what made you choose your professional field, you know, things like major milestones in your personal journey, key events, important mentors and inspirations, things like that, that will allow us a better view of you.
Okay, Michael. I would say my life pretty much is the experience of most Bhutanese. And maybe to start with, why did I choose serving in the Ministry of Finance? Why did I choose to become a public servant? In Bhutan, you know, that's the most sought after job is after enjoying the free health, free education that we strive to give back to our parents, to our community, to our country. And so the number one sought after job is to become a public servant. So unlike in other places, here we are very proud to say that we are bureaucrats. Hopefully more bureaucrat than bureaucrat. And in terms of my own personal journey, I think you know, I had, as I mentioned, pretty much the type of life most Bhutanese have. But I grew up at a time where things were quite difficult. I mean, when you talk about the development of Bhutan, literally the first motorable roads in our country were made in the 60s. So prior to that, it was just going by foot everywhere. That's the life my parents knew. So of course, I came at the time, a cusp when modernization began. And by the time I was born, at least a few places in Bhutan were connected by motorable roads. And in that sense, I was lucky because I joined, you know, I grew up at a time when the country was modernizing. So when in terms of my education, I was among those group of people who got scholarships to study outside Bhutan. And of course, you have to walk many days to reach a destination and to the closest Indian cities to take the motorable cars. So that's one reason why older generation, very few women are in positions of leadership. But that aside, I got to do my schooling in Protestant school in the hill station in India called Darjeeling.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, so I did my schooling there. It was very good, run by Protestants from Australia. And I think I consider myself fortunate to have got to a place like that, because I believe the really good education I got was what I got when I was in school. After that, I went to college, and like most college experience, it was a bit of a blur. And the college was in Bhutan itself, the only college we had. And after I completed my college in 88, as I mentioned, in 89, I joined the civil service. And in our generation, we were fortunate, and I always say that we had to have a plan to fail, because otherwise the default was you got jobs, things were quite easy. Unlike today, where now you have to have a plan to succeed because there's so much competition, etc. And as I mentioned earlier, I joined the Ministry of Finance. And in terms of my own life experiences and what were quite instrumental in shaping me, I think the most important experiences that had a deep imprint on me and why I chose to lead the life I do now is clearly the experience with my parents. My father was a civil servant He worked as what we call a wireless operator. Those days, this is long before mobile and even telephones. This is during the era of wireless, where you used Morse code to communicate. And so I guess at that time, my late father was at the forefront of technology for communication in the country. So since he was a civil servant, a lot of my childhood, we lived in various places in Bhutan. And I think that that experience of seeing my father dedicate his life to the country right until he's retired, and the enthusiasm with which he worked, the meaning he found in being able to provide this very useful information of communication and facilitating it for the people, etc. I think that left a very deep impact on me in terms of a mindset for public service. And of course, then personally, like most fathers, my late dad was my hero, and all the values, many things that I try to live up today are clearly, his impact on me. Other than that, actually, like most Bhutanese, the biggest, mentors, the role models for us are Their Majesties the Kings, the monarchs of Bhutan. For instance, His Majesty the Fourth King, who abdicated and now lives in retirement, and His Majesty the King. They have been great role models of what it means to serve, not only look out for one's interest, but above all, always to, look at the interest of the people, the country. And so that way, I was lucky because, as I mentioned earlier, in 2006, and I got this opportunity when His Majesty the King was a crown prince to work with His Majesty. And in the 2 years that I worked with His Majesty, I got to learn a lot. And then in 2008, after His Majesty was enthroned, I was appointed as the Secretary of the Gross National Happiness Commission. And that was a very fulfilling time because that was an era of electoral politics. We have become transitioned from an absolute monarchy to a democratic constitutional monarchy. So it was a very exciting time. And of course, that journey continues because we are a very young democracy. And in fact, today we're heading into elections. And other than that, other experiences, the stint in the civil service, trying to bring about reforms in the bureaucracy and try to change their mindset to real citizen orientation, was also quite a satisfying experience. Because for the longest time, bureaucrats are like the elites. They felt like the mindset was not really of serving the people. It was almost, it was not so service oriented, I would have to say. And we were trying to bring that change. So that's quite a experience trying to change mindset, not very easy. And after that, as I said, my latest work is about making the National Service Program and working to launch it. And this, again, is going to be nationally very impactful on the future of the country. So it's a very exciting time in my life, even though I'm at, this is something coming post-retirement. And more lately, if I were to talk about experiences that had a huge impact on what I'm doing and what I hope to continue to do, as soon as I retired in 2019, one of the first things I did is I went on a retreat, this Vipassana retreat, 10 days of silent meditation, no mobile, no pieces of paper, no writing, no nothing, just contemplation, 10 hours of meditation every day for 10 days. Wow. And that was a very powerful experience. And while I knew about this kind of things and I had been engaged in mindfulness activities, meditation, but that 10-day experience was extremely powerful. And so a lot of what I currently do, other than my work, is actually I promote mindfulness as a conscious activity, not only to get the most out of yourself as a person, but also to be able to make more of life, to see things more clearly, and really as the key to find that contentment or happiness that you're looking for, because actually that is where it resides. And maybe this is something we can come to later on. And I speak about this a lot because today a lot of the problems people have are not about the lack of food or clothing or shelter, which were the challenges we faced when we were growing up. Now it's all about mental health problems. It's not about a problem of lack of anything. It's just about the way people see things. And so this is where things like mindfulness, etc., are critical, actually, critical to one's well-being. That's all I have to share.
Well, that's a lot. That's a great deal you gave us to think about. Thank you for sharing all that. Really appreciate it very much. So the concept of gross national happiness originated in Bhutan. Can you introduce the basic idea? Tell us about the difference between gross national happiness and gross national product. Can you review the origin and the history of the idea and its link to Buddhist tradition? I think that would be very interesting to learn about as well. I know that you have a beautiful presentation, so please bring it up and we'll take it from there.
So, Michael, in terms of gross national happiness, and what I'm sharing with you are slides from this presentation. Gross national happiness, basically Bhutan's pursuit of happiness as the overall development goal. So when it comes to what is gross national happiness, you'll never really see it defined everywhere. But the idea is, of course, reflected in many documents. And here I would have to say that we have to look at gross national happiness in two ways. One is this idea of happiness that the country is pursuing, because we know that's what people ultimately want. And therefore, if you try to define that kind of happiness, we have to accept that is a very individual thing. And anything will be a gross, anything we try to define which can capture everyone's own idea of happiness will be misleading. So when we talk about gross national happiness, it's more the definition that the government uses in its work to create the conditions which will allow people or enable people to find the happiness they're looking for. And this is important because government action or inaction has a huge impact on people's ability to live the lives they want and to find what they want in life. So when we talk about gross national happiness, we are actually reflecting the government's outlook. And this is found in many official documents. And basically, we say that gross national happiness is both a vision and a philosophy for our country's development. And the idea is to find a better balance in terms of how we achieve development. It places people at the center of development and seeks to pursue activities that will enhance their well-being or help them find their happiness, rather than a narrow economic indicator like the GDP. So in that sense, it's very clear that gross national happiness is a conversation about the ends and not about the means. And of course, when it comes to the means, the economy, how we deal with the environment in particular is extremely important. And so are a whole host of other things. So in terms of what we mean by gross national happiness, that is what is important to realize, that it's about maximizing the happiness of the people. That development or what governments do or what progress leads to should ultimately be people finding that happiness they are looking for, whichever way they individually choose to define it. And in terms of the origins of gross national happiness, really, it can, we can go back as far as the 18th century, especially to the founding father of unified Bhutan, Shabdung Ngawang Namgyal. And in some of the pronouncement he made, he talks about this idea that the role of the government is to ensure that people achieve the happiness they want. But really, I would attribute the idea of pursuit of happiness from a government perspective really to His Majesty the Fourth King, His Majesty the Fourth King, who became the King of Bhutan in 1972 and ruled until his abdication in 2006. And it was His Majesty the Fourth King who really brought this to the fore, this idea of focusing on the ends, and that the ends are nothing but the happiness of the people. And indeed, the phrase gross national happiness can also be attributed to His Majesty the Fourth King. And the first time it was recorded was apparently in 1972, as per records from CBS, where in response to a question from a Financial Times journalist, His Majesty the Fourth King said, GNH, or gross national happiness, is more important than GDP, clearly drawing the distinction between ends and means. And it was during His Majesty the Fourth King's time that this idea of government focusing on creating the conditions that will allow people to achieve their happiness really took root in Bhutan. And but what you'll find is, if you really look at the literature or even government documents, you will not see anything about gross national happiness mentioned during his reign. And the simple reason for that is, during his reign, he was running the affairs of the country. He was chairing the cabinet that makes the development policies and decisions of the country. He was chairing the planning commission, which makes the development plans of the country. And so, since the author of the philosophy and vision of gross national happiness was himself running the affairs of the country, there was no need to define it, since his every word and his every act was taken to be the definition of gross national happiness. And so actually, if you really talk about the definition of gross national happiness, and then trying to create an index around it and use it to guide the development of the country's development, then that only happened after he stepped down. And this happened in 1998, when he voluntarily abdicated, when he voluntarily devolved all executive authority to a council of ministers that he nominated and the National Assembly appointed. And this was from 1998 till 2008. And then in 2008, when we became a democratic constitutional monarchy with the enactment of a constitution, then that was where really the further work on gross national happiness took place. And the first time gross national happiness was defined was in 1998, when His Majesty devolved his authority to this Council of Ministers. And then they felt that if we are to ensure that our country's development stays on this path, now that we don't have the author, His Majesty the Fourth King, to guide us, we better define it so that we ensure we stay on this path. And so you see, for the first time, gross national happiness being mentioned in government documents, and being the ideas of gross national happiness being elaborated in a document called Bhutan Vision 2020. So this is what I would share in terms of really the origin story of gross national happiness. Thank you.
So the making the idea that to many may sound very vague, happiness, making it concrete and ensuring that it will be actually implemented obviously requires quite a few steps. So let's see how you went on to implement it.
Yes, so when it comes to this, making it more concrete and making it more concrete in terms of guiding the development of the country, we of course drew on the work that was done in 1998. And in the 1998, the Vision 2020 document, which is a document to guide Bhutan's development for the next 20 years. I was part of that team. And so what we did is we looked at all the policies that was enacted during the Fourth King's time. So then we deconstructed. And when we deconstructed to understand what this gross national happiness is all about, what we saw is that 4 clear areas emerge, which we called the 4 pillars of gross national happiness. That if you want to pursue, achieve gross national happiness, which is happiness for all the people, then there are 4 pillars or foundations that basically create the conditions which will allow people to find that happiness. So what are these 4 pillars? The first is what we call sustainable and equitable socio-economic development. So what we saw is that during His Majesty the Fourth King's reign, development was characterized by a focus on ensuring that development not only takes place, but that is sustainable and equitable. And some key features under this pillar are free education, and universal primary enrollment was enacted during His Majesty the Fourth King's reign. Similarly, free healthcare, because these are the basics for a human, for anybody to get the most out of life. And the other thing which characterized His Majesty the Fourth King's reign and this pillar is poverty reduction, a focus on poverty reduction to bring people out of poverty, which necessitated rapid rural infrastructure development. So these were the main highlights under this pillar. The second pillar is conservation of the environment. And during the Fourth King's reign, what we saw is very strong policies to guard the environment, and these were captured in these policies. One policy to maintain the country's forest cover, and in fact, the one policy was to maintain 60% of country under forest cover, which later got enacted in our constitution. A commitment to maintain 60% of country under forest cover for all time to come. Another important policy under this pillar is over 50% of our country being declared as protected areas, which will ensure that our watersheds are protected, which will ensure that the wildlife can also flourish. So the country is not only declared as protected areas and parks, there are even biological corridors, which will ensure that human beings and natural environment and the wildlife can coexist peacefully, sustainably. And also another feature which under this pillar is the introduction of high environmental safeguards, the necessity for environment impact assessment in any development activity. And we have to remember that all this was in the early 70s onwards, when environment was not as fashionable as it is now with climate change issues, etc. Those days, these were not so fashionable, but it was His Majesty the Fourth King's foresight that we must protect the environment, and as a result of which we have today an environment we are proud of. So this is the second pillar. The third pillar is about preservation and protection of our culture and traditions. And here we are talking about things like our national dress. You see me wearing what we call a go. And this is an equivalent of a suit in the West. For all formal wear, we wear our national dress. And it was also His Majesty the Fourth King who took the policy to promote our traditional games like archery, promote our traditional arts and crafts, promote our language, our social etiquette. And I think it's important to recognize that a lot of what is good about Bhutan today is due to these far-sighted policies. When I told you that this is my national dress, and we are very proud to flaunt it and wear it every day, and our kids wear it to school, we wear it to office. But I remember there was a time in Bhutan when my late father was a wireless operator, and he used to go to office. This was in the late 60s, early 70s. There was a time they used to go to office wearing suits, wearing Western clothes, because a lot of modernization was westernization, but it was His Majesty the Fourth King who realized the importance of culture and tradition for a country's identity, which is also extremely important for one's well-being, that he took policies to say, no, we must protect our culture and traditions. How do we do that? This is our national dress. This is also part of what it means to be a Buddhist. From now on, for all formal wear, we will wear our national dress. And of course, it stirred a lot of, conversations. But today we look back and today we're very proud to say this is our culture and traditions. So what we have is not accidental, it's because of deliberate choices made because of this vision, this philosophy of gross national happiness. The fourth and final pillar is good governance. And in a sense, good governance undergirds all the other three pillars. And here, during the Fourth King's time, the focus was on decentralization and empowerment of the people. So it was an absolute monarch out of his own free will, very calibrated manner, devolving authority to the people, and it led, as I mentioned, to the enactment of the constitution, where we became a democratic constitutional monarchy. And the other focus during his reign were improving the performance of the three tiers of government that makes up the government framework in Bhutan: local government, districts, and the central government, and also a huge emphasis on fighting corruption and making sure that it does not take root, promoting media, promoting civil society. Of course, during His Majesty the Fourth King's reign, most famously, he introduced TV and internet. So this is what we call the four pillars of gross national happiness that guided Bhutan's development from 1998. And then in 2008, His Majesty the present King was enthroned as the fifth King of Bhutan. His Majesty the Fourth King went into abdicated, and we enacted the constitution. And when we did that, then we took further concrete steps to ensure the pursuit of gross national happiness, which is also required by Article 9.2 of our constitution, that the state should create conditions which will allow people to attain gross national happiness. So what were these steps? Basically, first we created an index. Secondly, we created an organization that will plan the development of the country guided by this index and allocate resources, etc. Accordingly. Third, we created a policy screening tool to ensure that all policies that we enact enhance gross national happiness. And lastly, we conducted GNH surveys to see how we are doing vis-a-vis what it is we are trying to achieve in terms of the conditions we are creating for people to find happiness. So if we turn to the gross national happiness index, why do we need an index? Well, in terms of the purpose is to set a framework for Bhutan's development. It's an indicator, almost like a compass, to gauge and guide our development. And as I mentioned, by doing periodic surveys, we can see how we are doing vis-a-vis our efforts to enhance the well-being of our people. And this is where we then had to take the idea of the four pillars and break it down further so that it can really be used by the government agencies, the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Economic Affairs, the Ministry of Education, etc., to guide the policies and the programs they make. And so this is the work that was spearheaded by a think tank we have in Bhutan called the Center for Bhutan Studies and GNH Research. And they came out with this idea, with this framework called, they created the GNH index and came out with this framework, which has 9 domains and 33 indicators. So basically the 4 pillars were broken down further into these 9 domains, and these together make up GNH index. So we use this GNH index like the UN HDI index to measure our progress, but in particular it measures the areas we feel are critical as conditions for people to find happiness. So very quickly, if I were to take you all through this, the GNH index is made up of 9 domains. But if you look at the 9 domains, if you look at the slide in front of you, 5 of the domains are in white. And they are in white to show that they are more the conventional areas most governments focus on. For instance, standard of living, for instance, health, because it's important for people. For instance, education, for instance, good governance, for instance, environment. Of course, we are not doing a good job there, but I think we all can agree now it is squarely there on most governments' development agenda. The 4 other areas which Bhutan focuses on, which are critical for creating the right conditions to people to find happiness, they are what we feel more innovative. What are these areas that the government focuses on to guide its policy making and formulation of its programs? One is psychological well-being, another is cultural diversity and resilience, another is community vitality and time use. So let me briefly take you through the more innovative domains. So like I mentioned, this I think are standards, so I will not take you through living standards, health, education, good governance, and the environment. But if you look at turn to the innovative domains, one of the areas we look at is psychological well-being. And here, the indicators that make up this domain are life satisfaction, emotional balance, and spirituality. And why do we focus on this domain? It is simply recognizing that as human beings, there's a spiritual side to us, the non-material side to us, which also actually requires nourishment. And indeed, the more we get into the happiness studies, what we are finding is, in terms of happiness, actually, it's more what people are able to do in terms of this domain. Because ultimately, happiness comes down to, it's a state of mind. It's a state of mind. And therefore, so much of whether you're happy or not comes down to how you look at things and not really the objective reality or the situation you are in. It's the perspective or that you carry. So this is turning out to be an extremely important area. And because this area is important, and indeed because of this domain, one policy it led to is the introduction of meditation in all our schools in 2010. Why? Recognizing that eventually happiness is ultimately a state of mind, then you need to give people the tools. Like you tell them you want a healthy body, go for walks, do things, eat well, etc. Then you'll have a healthy body. Well, in terms of a healthy mind, which is even more important than the body, you also need to do things. You need to nourish it. It doesn't happen automatically. And one activity that's proven to have a positive impact in terms of psychological well-being is an activity like meditation, which I almost consider as an exercise to enhance your mindfulness. And if you are able to enhance your mindfulness, then almost automatically well-being arises. Indeed, you must have heard this saying, a wandering mind is an unhappy mind. And it turns out that is the name of a scientific paper, which is published in one of the most, I think, high credibility journals. I think it's the Nature journal. And basically alluding to the fact that if you have a wandering mind, then happiness is going to be distant for you. And this is indeed one of the main challenges for people, that their happiness, unhappiness is not so much the lack of material things, is because most of us have a wandering mind and we do not know how to deal with it. And that's why we introduce meditation in our schools. Another innovative domain is cultural diversity and resilience. And this looks at things like language, artistic skills, socio-cultural participation, including the strength of relationships and social etiquette. And this is basically all about identity. And again, if you look at the well-being and happiness studies, and I'm referring to scientific studies, it is clear that a strong sense of identity is indeed extremely important, and it's our culture and tradition which are the biggest source of that identity. And this domain simply recognizes that, and under this we continue to promote our language, our traditional games like archery, etc. The third innovative domain is community vitality, and this is all about relationships, social support. Not only giving money, but giving time in particular is valued highly. Community relationships, relationships among family members, and the absence of crime. Again, I think it's not surprising, and indeed there's a 70-plus-year Harvard study which followed a group of people, and the end finding from the study is that in terms of happiness for people, it all comes down to relationships, the number of relationships and the strength of those relationships. And so in a similar manner, this is what we focus on, trying to see as we develop, is the community strong? Because if the community, the fabric of society weakens, then in spite of the material gains, happiness is going to be a bigger challenge. And so this area keeps the government focused on activities that will ensure that the community is kept strong even as we modernize. But of course, it's easier said than done, and we can turn to that later. And finally, time use. In time use, we look at the apportionment of time in terms of the three big aggregates that it is made up of. If you look at time use, the 24 hours a day, we need some time for working, obviously. We also need some time for resting. And then, of course, we need some time for sleeping. And so this is just looking at that because, again, if you really think about it, time is actually the most scarce resource, not money. And indeed, in the GNH outlook, I would say time is not hours and seconds on a clock. It's basically life. And so time use is actually going to be an extremely important lens to look at if you want to find that happiness you're looking for, because you only have so many hours in a day and you can only do one thing. And so this is an extremely important constraint, and therefore we place it on our development policy making agenda, because we find, for instance, that if you look at the experience of development around the world, you see big cities with large number of people who have to commute for hours, and all studies have shown that use of time or life spent commuting is one of the lowest quality use of your time or your life. And so because we have a domain like this, our hope is that even as we develop, that because we keep look at what we're doing through this lens, that hopefully we can get the benefits of modernization, but avoid pitfalls like unnecessary long commuting, which is such a waste of time or waste of life. So these are basically the 9 domains made up of 33 indicators, and there are more variables under that. And so if we look further how we use this in 2 fashions. One, to make policies, and another, we conduct the surveys where we see the results vis-a-vis these indicators, and which gives the government a sense of where we are doing well and where we need to do better. So if I very quickly turn to firstly the policy screening tool. This is a tool we created based on the GNH index, and we use it mandatorily to screen all policies, irrespective of where it originates in the government. And the idea is that we put on a pair of this GNH lens, almost like sunglasses, and then look at the policies. And we select or endorse those policies that enhance GNH and reject those they do not. And the tool itself is simple. The idea is powerful, but the tools are very simple. So every policy, we look at it, and then we have this group of people who represent all important stakeholders, and looking at the policy, they rate it and see whether the policy will have a positive effect or negative effect in terms of the variables or indicators we have selected from the GNH index. So for instance, one variable is stress. So we look at the policy and say, if we introduce this policy, will it increase levels of stress? Will it decrease? Or we do not know what the effect is likely to be, or it will have a positive effect, that this policy will decrease levels of stress in the population. Then, in a similar way, there are a number of variables that the participants use to screen, and finally we total up these numbers, and if it crosses a minimum threshold, we pass the policy. If it does not, we reject the policy and tell the originators of the policy to review it so that they address the areas of concern. And based on this policy screening tool, this is an example of the policies we passed. We approved about 24 policies during my time there, and a few years after that I updated this. Economic development policy, public debt policy, etc. were passed. And some policies which were pending, and I can highlight one which kept being rejected a couple of times during my tenure in the Gross National Happiness Commission. The mineral development policy, which was to do with mining and extraction, it did not cross the GNH policy screening tool thresholds, and therefore constantly had to go back. And in fact, it is still pending because people are not comfortable that this will have a positive impact in terms of gross national happiness. So this is just to give an idea of how the policy screening tools are used. The other things we get based on the GNH index is we carry out this service and we get the results. So here I'm sharing with you very briefly survey results from 2015. So if you look at the survey is based on those 9 domains, and these are the results of the 2015 survey. All the 9 domains have equal weight, but if you look at this pie chart, then you can see the ones which have taken more than their share means they're doing better. So for instance, we can see that health is doing well, environment conservation efforts, we're doing well in terms of in terms of the indicators and what we're able to do. In terms of the strength of relationships, community vitality, also we are doing quite okay. Now, on the other hand, if you look at the areas where we could do better, education is not so good, good governance is not so good, etc. So this gives a snapshot, overall snapshot of how we are doing vis-a-vis the 9 domains. But if we go into the variables, 33 indicators make up the 9 domains, and we see that people are happy in terms of values, things like speaking our own language, sense of safety, strength of families, people enjoying a high level of sufficiency, which means the high level of satisfaction. Areas where the government needs to do better on the other side, knowledge. That means there's still a lot of challenge in terms of education, which is understandable because there is still a large segment of the population who do not have an opportunity to receive good education. Similarly, government performance, schooling, spirituality, donations, time and money. Here, the satisfaction is less. So this gives an idea if you look at the GNH index in terms of the 33 indicators that make up the 9 domain. You can also look at the results geographically. So if you look at geographically, the overall GNH index results in terms of where people enjoy more sufficiency or satisfaction, the dark green areas. So clearly the capital region, these are the region here, we are enjoying more sufficiency. And the lighter region is where people are enjoying less sufficiency. And in terms of development, what it tells us as policymakers is these are the areas we need to address going forward. See what it is they're lacking and how we can address it, because here there are more unmet needs and therefore lower levels of GNH satisfaction. We can also look at these results by rural, urban. We can look at it by male, female, and there's a correlation. If you look at male, female, just we see that males are in blue, females are in orange. So if you look at the areas where overall male seems to be enjoying more satisfaction in terms of the GNH index than females in Bhutan overall. And if you look at the areas where this is pronounced, one is in education, and this might be a legacy, because I mentioned in the old days girls could not go to school because you had to walk for many days.
I think Karma, the extent of comprehensiveness and rigor is quite astonishing. I don't know that many countries have been able to do this kind of things. So I was wondering about you. I know that the concept of gross national happiness have been gaining some momentum and influence around the world. There was the resolution at the United Nations at 2011, the declaration of the International Happiness Day, the World Now Happiness Report, and so forth. How do you see that impact on other countries, and where do you think it's going?
One thing I can share from my own experience, even when I was the Secretary of the Gross National Happiness, is that there is growing interest. There is growing interest in this idea. And this is from a time where, when you talk about happiness, you're met with skepticism or cynicism. But more lately, and especially from, I would say, from His Majesty the Fourth King's latter part of his reign to His Majesty the present King's time, and especially as environmental challenges have come to the fore, I think people are taking this conversation around happiness and focusing on the ends and separating it from the means much more seriously. And how do I know this? Because I have myself been invited to a number of countries because of their interest in what we're doing, how we're going about things, and then they're trying to see how it can be applied. Of course, at the national level, I think that politics makes it too challenging to go down the road like this, because I don't think happiness sells as well as fear. But at the local government level, there's a lot of interest, and in fact, some of the local communities, they're even using our GNH index, of course, suitably amended for their communities. For example, in Brazil, for example, in Thailand, for example, in Korea, even in Japan, I heard that there are some communities trying this. So there are interests, and at the level of the people, this speaks to them, because this is what people want. So there is growing interest, and another experience which reflects this growing interest in this is when the United Nations was getting, holding discussions on the post-2015 development agenda, with the MDGs coming to an end. I was a member of the open working group representing Bhutan. And there, of course, I got to share about gross national happiness, and it was very well received. And in fact, it has found its place in the sustainable development goals. And I think sustainable development goals, while not at the same level as the GNH index, but it's it has really moved to measure areas which will lead to societies thriving from an MDGs which focus on the bare necessities just to survive. So I'd
like to actually raise one more question before we turn it to the audience. Bhutan is a relatively very small country and culturally very homogeneous. And I think it's reflected in the coming together around all those values that are at the heart of the concept of gross national happiness. How do you see the prospect of the GNH kind of framework expanding further? We've just talked a little bit about it. And can it really find a place at the core of efforts to establish the concept of sustainability as the organizing principle on the planet. So Bhutan obviously could play a major leadership role there in spite of its size and everything else. How do you see this going?
Well, firstly, I'm just reflecting on a very popular author, Yuval Noah Harari, and he spoke about in his second book, I think, Homo Deus, the targets for humanity. And the three targets for humanity he had were immortality, happiness, and divinity. And I think this idea that if we don't focus on what it is we really want for ourselves, then I think development is not only going to be unsustainable, but it is definitely not going to lead to what people want. So I think this having this clarity is extremely important. Now, will countries take it on board because they are so diverse? Then it comes back to this idea of, if you look at what I just spoke about, are there aspects which you cannot relate to you? I find that actually it is quite universal in terms of its applicability, but it must reflect locally what your situation is. So I speak about culture and tradition here, and I show you my goal. But of course, if an American local government in Minnesota were to adopt this, I think their culture is not go, but I don't know. I'm sure they have some culture. I can't imagine a society without culture, because then we would be, I guess, back to Homo sapiens days. So I think the framework itself can be applied universally, but it has to be tailored. And that's what I meant when I mentioned that wherever I shared this, people could relate to it. But of course, they know that in their context, for instance, community vitality might be a very different idea from the Buddhist idea of community vitality, but they agree that more social interactions, more meaningful relationships are the bedrock of happiness. So I think there is universal applicability. Now, will it take off? And I think this is where the top down from the national, I think, looks too challenging. And from the bottom up, from civil society organizations, from communities, from businesses which want to use such an index to make sure their business is sustainable. If we can do that, I think we can get there, because the framework, I think, is the value add of what Bhutan has been able to present in terms of an index to guide development. And this framework, if you look, it is holistic. And I think you make better choices when you look at things holistically than when you look at things in silos. So I think there are many advantages, and those who take time to understand this actually can see that there are many benefits, which is why even some businesses have started using this. And indeed, in Bhutan, we have tried to create a GNH index for business, so that they can get a GNH certification if they pass our thresholds, which means what they do is good for society, is good for the employees, and is sustainable. Thank you for the
Karma, again, I only can say thank you again. I can't tell you how inspiring, informative, and really deep and concrete all this is, and how relevant it is actually to the work we're trying to do with the lab. So there's a lot that we can learn there and try to deepen and expand our own work. Before we actually close, I wonder if you can take a moment to give us like a special message from Bhutan.
Well, I don't know about special message, but what I would encourage is that people pay more attention to their mind. And I mentioned this briefly, but I think the more you're looking for happiness, satisfaction in your life, then it's really requires that you take a closer look at how you see things. Nothing we see is objective. Everything we see is filtered through the lens of our prejudices, our upbringing, our beliefs, our religious values. And a lot of your happiness, sadness may not be, it may just be the influence of the wrong perceptual frameworks in a sense. And that's where I speak about this idea of mindfulness, that is healthy to nourish your mind. But the other things is it helps you to see things more clearly. And if you see things more clearly, then drawing from Buddhist wisdom, this life is a gift. You got the lottery. Every moment is a miracle. If you realize the stars in the sky to the fishes in the oceans, enjoy and make the most of this life. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you so much again. Thank you everyone for joining us. And we'll continue with our incredible conversation. Thank you so much.
Michael, thank you for having me. And I wish you all the very best in all the good work that you're doing.
We look forward to seeing you soon sometime, I hope. Bye-bye.
Thank you.